Hello, listeners. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. And today I'm joined by the wonderful Isabella, who is going to introduce herself. But I've had the privilege of meeting with a few times now. And we've had some really great conversations around creating high performance in ourselves, in teams, in individuals, all together, that we're going to dive into today. So, hi, Isabella.
Hi, Vicky. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank
Just as a short intro to myself, so I'm Canadian. I started my career in Canada in Toronto in HR. My career has mostly been in luxury retail or consumer-facing brands. But in the pandemic, I started my company with my husband called Kind Community, where I've consulted scale-ups and SMEs on their people strategies and building high-performing teams. And I am currently a head of people for Facegym.
Yes, amazing. Such a great intro. And so fun, I think, for people listening that are thinking, like, what are the different options even within this career? Like, you've actually created different options at the same time, which is very on brand for us speaking about high performance. You are clearly a high performer.
I think so. But I think it's really important for me to not have kind of a secular career. I really love being in people. I think HR is a little bit outdated, just the term. I really believe that people are assets and not resources. Um, but yes, my career, if you were to look at my resume, is a bit eclectic. So although I have worked in kind of the people department, I have had multiple kind of different roles, both operational, both strategic. One thing that was really important to me was to learn a lot more about like the commerciality of, how people can really support the business as a whole and how people really are, like I mentioned, the assets to driving a business forward. So I was really fortunate enough to kind of take a sideways step in my career that was supporting the chairman's office for this luxury retail group that I worked for to learn more about actually how the business operated. And one of the key focuses in that role was our people during a really turbulent time during the pandemic, where I think the whole world had a bit of a reset, particularly businesses around how valuable the team was to the success and of their business, and how important well-being and all these different elements of us that make us human should really be topics of conversation for the business. And that kind of led me to start my own business, as I mentioned, which was an exhilarating time. I started, as I mentioned, with my husband. It works for some people, it doesn't work for others. It worked for us for the time. But I really wanted to have, a little bit more of an impact, particularly for kind of a little bit more established scale ups.
Mhm.
And hence why, I'm consulting and also leading up the people strategy and team for Facegym, as I mentioned. So look, am I a high performer? I think so in my kind of description of it. But I also feel like there's always opportunity to continue to perform in different ways
Yeah.
in different roles.
I think what you just said was really important. You said in my way of it, because I think if we measure every person's performance the same way, then we miss. I love that quote that it's like if you look at a bird's ability to swim, you miss it can fly. And I think that's what's true. Like different people are attracted to different teams with different skills, with different brains. And like it's not like a three tick checkbox of like what is high performance.
I couldn't agree more. I think there's multiple, I think, factors of what a high performing individual is and what that means to a business, but actually, again, what that means to that individual. So, when I first started my career, high performance to me then is completely different than what it is now that I'm managing a team. For me, high performance is actually creating the space where my team can actually succeed and have a voice at the table where the decisions are being made and they feel like they are being accomplished. And I think this kind of segues into the communication aspect of being a high performer, especially if you're a leader, is how are you communicating their value and the purpose and the vision so that everyone can really align on what that means for them.
Yes, absolutely. It's like even the same person, the definition of high performance evolves with us. So one of the things that we spoke about, you and I, was around evaluating and creating effective feedback to improve performance.
Mhm.
So is there anything that you can share with our listeners around like effective ways to evaluate versus like ineffective performance reviews? Like what have you seen worked well? What have you seen not work well?
Yes. And I think my view on performance reviews may not totally align with people in kind of in HR or in leadership, but I really feel that a 1 or 2 year performance review should be completely abolished. I don't think that they're effective whatsoever. I don't think that people actually enjoy attending their biannual or their yearly performance review. And I also don't think that management or leaders who have to actually host those sessions look forward to them either. Because, um, if you could think of something that you do twice a year that you're good at, I would challenge you to think of what is it that you do once or twice a year that you're good at. And I really think that providing feedback is something that people need to kind of harness and develop themselves and get comfortable with that. So to me, I think, look, performance reviews, do they have a purpose in business? Yes, when it potentially comes to comp and reward, but it shouldn't just be a two-time kind of assessment that you're looking back at. I really believe that feedback should be continuous, because especially for scale ups, the goalposts could continuously be changing. So, that could be quarterly resets of what is the target that we're trying to reach, or what is it that we're trying to kind of accomplish in this quarter. And look, I think when you look about time, everyone, depending on your role, I think the best time that you can take is speaking to your teams and having that space to communicate with your teams on, what's working, what's not working, how can you support them, and understanding actually where do they see themselves in the next quarter, so that you could kind of you can align both the operational goals, but also the individuals' goals together and inspire them to support the
Mhm.
business overall.
Yeah, and I love what you shared there, just for anyone listening, is like just because there's 90% of the people looking left, when you go in, when you develop your career, when you want to like taking that radical ownership for actually, I don't think this thing is going to work for the type of company we are, the type of team we are, is really valuable. We use a framework that I also teach our clients. It's called Successful Weeks, where it's like we each responsible for setting and outlining what our successful weeks looks like, and that's public, so we can all see it, and then evaluating it, and then we can kind of we're always learning from each other, but
Learning.
self-evaluation, I think, is what you're saying, and I think exactly what you're sharing is we're taught like the person that's not been on the journey can't evaluate the same as the person who's been in it and said like, okay, I tested this thing, this is where I didn't perform, this is where I did perform but the results weren't what I thought they were going to be, this is where I did perform and the results were what I thought they were going to be. um
Yeah.
so it's a different depth and a different like responsibility as well, I think, when you're working with leaders.
Absolutely. Um, and I always compare it to like high performing sports teams. Not that I'm a sports fanatic, but I've heard I'm trying to think of who I heard this from in the past. Oh, Patty McCord, who is she led up the People team for Netflix, and she wrote the Culture Handbook, and it's one of the best things I think that have come out of Silicon Valley. And she often compares, high performance to sports teams. And if you look at, for example, a football team, and I'm not going to name any coaches because, like I said, I'm not super into sports. But what I do know is that after every game, the coaches get together and they speak to their teams about what they did really well and what they need to improve on for the next game. They'll get feedback from each other, from the team members on that team. They'll speak to the other coaches, and then they will set up a play specifically based on the strengths and weaknesses of their team and how they work collaboratively together to ensure that they hit it out of the park on the next play in the next game. And I really think we should take that model and incorporate it into business. And like I said, having those quarterly or monthly goals because things are changing so quickly. Of course, you'll have the North Star, you'll have the vision for the year potentially and where you want to be as a company. But there are projects that are continuously evolving. And there's no reason why you can't have those touch points, if not weekly, monthly, to say, okay, as a team or as a company, this is what we've done really well. This is what we could improve on. You know, this department is really strong at this, and next game or next month, this is what we really need to kind of leverage. And I really like that idea, and I've tried to incorporate it myself, and it has worked quite well. But again, I had to get comfortable with being able to provide that feedback, but I also had to provide the space for my team to also be comfortable in receiving that feedback. And I think that's also really important, is like, how do you build trust amongst your team for them to feel comfortable, you know, to always kind of be continuously learning, as you mentioned.
So good. So what would you say to someone? We do have an episode on this around how to build trust, but I'm just curious as you speak about the value of this. So how do you create that trust for feedback?
I think it's so important in the first couple of, you know, weeks, like as you enter into this leadership role or as you take on a team, to survey the team. Like, ask them what has worked, what hasn't worked, what are, like, you know, previous grievances that they've had, and so that you can understand kind of the history. What are, you know, the things that they really want to sink their teeth into so that you can leverage that. But also, um you know, what are their personal goals? Like, you need to show up as a human being as well and care about them. And just like you can't force people to work, you can't force people to be vulnerable. So I think you have to demonstrate it yourself, and be quite honest about the expectations that you have of yourself, of what your, you know, boss has of you. And being quite honest, you know, there's obviously a fine line of, you know, oversharing potentially, but I'm kind of more of a super communicator than not. So I tend to kind of lead by example. I'm a big also believer in, like, the apology, like learning how to apologize when you're wrong. I know some people believe, like, never say sorry, you know, kind of twist it into something else or make it seem like it's not your fault, where I really don't believe that. I think that being a good apologizer is a great opportunity to kind of lead or kind of create that space, for your team, because we're human, we're going to mess up. And I think, you know, there's just little things. I think the most important for me, or that has worked for me, is demonstrating what, you know, what can lead to being vulnerable in your role.
Yes, I love that. So we're speaking about communication now, and you shared with me that you have like a form that you send to people before meetings. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I also think like high performance individuals, high performance teams, high performance meetings.
Yes. So as I said, like, we'll have quarterly targets or goals that we want to hit, and I'll be very clear on what that looks like from a business perspective, but also what that means for them. So what do they want to achieve personally and professionally in that time? And that you know, you try to kind of align together, but there may be things personally that they want to achieve that you could also influence. So going back to the question of this form that I've created, this form also came about because I have, at the time, I had 6 people that were working on my team, and I would put in, you know, 1 hour calls weekly. That's 6 hours of my time. And what I was finding is, okay, how can I maximize the value of that time? Because they were, you know, great conversations, but actually in terms of impact, I wasn't sure actually how impactful they were. You know, it was kind of going down task lists, you know, you were building that connection with the team, but the following conversation the following week was often, you know, a repeat of what we talked about the week prior. So I built out this form, which is, their progress of the week, their problems, and the plan. And then the final question is, how are you feeling? Because I think that's really important as well. And progress was very much like, let's celebrate the wins. What have you achieved? And like, let's take a moment to recognize that. What are the challenges or the problems that you're facing, and how can I support you with that? But I also put in plan, because I want my team members to really think about okay, I've set out the problems that I face, but I want them to think more strategically about, okay, this is my plan on how to address this, but I still do need support from you. Or that could look in different ways. It could be support, it could be sign off, it could be buy-in, but it gets them to think quite strategically and structured so that we can have an open conversation, but we're still addressing, how next week we can progress even further. So that's worked for me. My team seems to be enjoying it as well. And the conversations I think are more efficient and effective for the time that we're spending. But again, it takes time, it takes practice, and it also allows you, I think, to get to know your team members a little bit better based on how they're structuring the form. So for example, the first couple of weeks, progress were a couple of bullet points. And I was like, I'm not having any of this. We need to start, stop being so humble or just not tooting your own horn. We need to shout about what you've accomplished, because if you're not, nobody will. And again, it's getting comfortable with talking about your progress. And that can look different for different people.
Yeah, absolutely. Like even our brain has a negativity bias where it thinks like good things aren't important, and it's very focused on the problems and potential dangers. So it's like our social conditioning, our evolution programming, like all of these things come into play. So for anyone listening that's like, yeah, I also struggle to celebrate myself, like I do think it's a habit and a skill that you can develop, and the more you do it, the easier it gets. So
100%. And also, just kind of going back to businesses that are in scale up or SMEs, like in the economy that we're in, budgets are tight. And you have to be very creative with how you're utilizing that budget effectively. And I have been in businesses where, potential, I think from a people perspective, oftentimes the first budgets to be cut is actually development, which I don't agree with. But if you look at development, for example, yes, you do need the backing from, the leadership team around, we are going to invest in our team members. But if we don't have the budget for it right now, or the budget that you need, what else can you do to develop your team? And I really think that having those conversations around, how can I support you? What is your progress? What are the problems? That in itself is development. And putting your progress, I think, also allows your team member to kind of take a step back and say, wow, like this is what I've learned. This is what I'm actually doing. And, most likely they're not going to be in your company for their whole lives, right? So you can really support them in framing, like, this is what you've accomplished here. This is what we should be celebrating. And in whatever your next role is, and let's talk about what that can be and how I can support you to get there. Let's always refer back to, your one-to-one structured forms and look at the progress of what you've done in your time here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just so everyone knows, we're going to have a link in the podcast so you can access that PDF too. That's very kind of Isabella to share with us. Yeah, so another thing that you spoke about that you mentioned when we first spoke that I thought was really interesting is like every business problem is a people problem. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yes. I mean, not to be like super radical or anything, but it is true. Like, name me a business problem that doesn't lead back to your team or that can't be solved by your team. Your best new hire is the team you already have, right? It's just how you're framing the challenges and how you're, I think, leveraging the knowledge and creativity of your team to solve those problems. So every kind of challenge that is communicated to me from a business perspective, again, being a bit biased, but it's how did we first of all get here? And it could be because we have potentially disengaged teams. Maybe let's give an example, like our customer feedback, our Trustpilot score is going down, or and then hence that now has an impact on the amount of people who are coming into our retail stores, which then means impact to our bottom line. So why is that happening? Why are customers not rating us, as we were? Is most maybe because we're not giving them exceptional experiences anymore. you know, maybe the service quality isn't as great. You know, potentially, you know, because of inflation, our prices have gone up, and that's impacting, you know, the accessibility. But there's still opportunities for our people to impact that. So it's, again, going back to your teams and understanding, okay, well, is customer service going down because they themselves don't feel like we're treating them as our customer as a business, right? So yeah, I really do believe that every problem can be solved, or, you know, is a people problem. And I think, again, like, businesses really need to look at, you know, we focus a lot on marketing, we focus a lot on our customers, but we need to put that same emphasis on our internal teams, because what our customer feels about our business should be the same feeling that our own teams feel about the brand. And I often feel like there is that disconnect.
Well, like, there's a disconnect between what the people think about the brand and the customers think.
I think so. I think, you know, we're really good at putting, potentially some businesses are really good at putting a lot of emphasis and a lot of energy behind, yeah, brand and like marketing and how we communicate to our customer. But I'm not sure. You know, I obviously there's some companies who do an incredible job at this. But I really believe that marketing and HR should almost, you know, work together side by side, because that same message should be driven by our teams. And if there's that disconnect, actually, that is what's going to cause probably the biggest problems in your businesses, is customers feeling, you know, connecting to the brand, but then when they come to get that experience, because there's that disconnect with your team, them not feeling the same way, the perception of what they're going to experience and the actual reality of that experience is going to be completely different. And that in itself could tarnish a business so much. So I think it's kind of building that brand, co-collaborating with that messaging with your team.
Yeah, I think that's a really cool concept and very like powerful for anyone listening to think about. Like, do your HR or head of people or people and culture teams even speak to the marketing team? Like,
Yeah.
is there any kind of collaboration there? And what would be the impact if there was? I
Yeah.
think that's very cool. Is there anything else that you think people should be considering when it comes to developing high performance teams?
Um, I think it's understanding how people like communicate again, right? And what how they see themselves, but also where they want to go. I think you need to kind of look at, you know, everybody has different ambitions, everyone has different goalposts for themselves personally, and that's okay. But you can't take the same approach of how you provide that feedback, how you communicate the goals, and how you get people inspired in the same way. So I think, you know, as a leader, it's like spending that time again to understand human to human. How do you want me to show up for you? Because ultimately, I think people are hired because they have a specific skill set. Either that be that they're really good at strategy, they're good at software development. But actually, if they're not as inspired by the vision anymore, or they're a bit disengaged, you can't force them to work. So building that connection and building that safe space for them, I mean, understanding, okay, intrinsically what motivates them will hopefully move the dial. And yeah, and I think it'll just open that conversation. So sorry, that was a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it's just really understand that we all communicate in different ways, and really spending the time to get to know how your team want to communicate.
Yeah. We actually have someone coming on the podcast, and part of their onboarding process, which we are going to share with people, is asking that, like, how do you like to be communicated? And then it's like kept on file so people can read it afterwards, which I think is really cool, because the main message that I'm getting from you is like, high performance teams aren't one size fits all. High performance individuals aren't one size fits all. High performance communication, conversation, dialogue, like anything that we're doing is also not one size fits all. And how do we manage that? As people person, we manage it by listening, like actually listening and providing opportunities for people to communicate.
Yeah. And I also love, you know, sometimes I think they're incorporated in recruitment processes or even within like development planning or these conversations. I think it can happen at any point, but it's really important, I think, early on to potentially incorporate like personality assessments as well. Because I think having that like self-reflection for, you know, as an employee of understanding, oh, like that's right, that is really how I, you know, show up. But also I want my leader to know that that's who I am. So it may be that, for example, I'm an introvert, but you wouldn't know that because I need to kind of be quite extroverted. I need to over communicate in my team for my team. But actually I find it quite exhausting. So I need to be able to communicate that to my team where after if I'm in a meeting for 2 hours, I just can't have any meetings after that. I just need some time to like process all the information I've gathered. And especially if I was presenting, I need to take a couple of hours. But that they know that. So it wouldn't come as a shock to them after a meeting if something, you know, if they want to have a meeting with me where I'm just like, no, I don't have time for you, you know? So it's just, I think having some sense of self-awareness is really important. I think like behavioral testing tools or personality tests are really a great tool to understand yourself, but also for your teams to understand themselves, and kind of build that as well.
Yes, absolutely. Amazing. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing all this wisdom. Is there anything that you want to add that we've not covered before we close out?
I mean, I'll probably think of something for hours about, you know, building really successful teams. But I think you mentioned it like perfectly. There's no one size fits all. I think it takes, again, the self-awareness to understand your team. It takes time. And also when you get it wrong, apologize and build that safe space for continuous learning and communication.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming to share. For everyone listening, Isabella's LinkedIn and more about Kind Community will be in the show notes. So will the PDF that she's spoken about with the questions. And so, by the way, will be a form if you want to recommend anyone or come on the podcast yourself as an expert. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this, found it useful, please leave us a little review or share about us on LinkedIn or whatever you feel like doing to help get these important conversations in more people's ears. Thank you so much, Isabella, and thank you.
Thank you.